You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The United Nations has criticised the Vatican for failing to protect children from paedophile priests as investigators in Geneva probe the scandal that rocked the Catholic Church. The hearing in Geneva was the first time that the Vatican has been confronted publicly over the sexual abuse of children by clergy. Officials faced a barrage of hard questions covering why they would not release data and what they were doing to prevent abuse. Pope Francis has set up a Vatican committee to fight sexual abuse of children in the Catholic Church and to offer help to victims. He has said that dealing with sex abuse is vital for the Church's credibility. And how effectively is the Church dealing with it? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Peter D. Williams from the group Catholic Voices. Also here in the studio is Pete Saunders, founder of the group National Association for People Abused in Childhood, or NAPAC, and also in the studio Father Paul Keane, who is chaplain for the University of Essex. And on the line from Geneva we have David Greenwood, who's chairman of the Stop Church Child Abuse campaign. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, just on the developments in Geneva, can I get your reactions on the hearing? Does the Catholic Church's officials, what they say, Pete, does that satisfy you?
Well, can I just add that I am also Catholic, so there's another Catholic voice here. What I've read so far would seem to be encouraging, that the statement made before the convention was exactly what I would have expected to hear. And as always, and as we often say, actions speak louder than words. The Catholic Church, in common with many, many other institutions, does have problems in certain areas, and the one that we're concerned with at NAPAC are adult survivors of childhood abuse. I speak as a person who was also assaulted by Catholic priests as a child, and know many other people who suffered likewise. So, as well as being involved with the charity that supports survivors, I also have a very personal interest in this matter. Whether it be the Vatican or any other organisation, we are always interested in moving forward and protecting children, and the Vatican's desire to support and help victims, I think, is absolutely crucial. I think we've moved on somewhat in recent years from a culture of denial and silence, but I hope that we're here to move on and to ensure that what happened to me and many others doesn't occur in the future.
Is there a sense that this is coming to a head? This is some kind of catharsis for you, given your personal experience and of course for thousands of others?
The history of the Church and many other institutions, as I've said, is a reluctance to address these issues, I think, historically, and the institutions have often been dragged into the equation, and it haven't necessarily come willingly, but have been forced there, often by the actions of survivors or victims, if you want to call them that. I may be a lone voice in lots of survivor organisations in saying that I have some expectation and hope for the new Pope. He has astounded me so far with some of the things that he has said. I mean, astounded me in a very positive way.
In a positive way.
You know, to hear a Pope refer to "who am I to judge people who are homosexual," I think is amazing, especially given that, you know, many clergy within the Catholic Church are gay. And just the reference a few days ago to why would women have to hesitate about breastfeeding their children in the Sistine Chapel. It might seem sort of simplistic, and what's that all about? But actually, I think it's a really significant move forward, because when he became Pope, he said he wanted to lead poor church for the poor. That is very sort of biblical, and I'm all for that. But we'll wait and see about the actions on abuse, what this commission holds, and how the Church supports victims.
First of all, I just go to David in Geneva. We're less than a year into this new papacy, but I mean, do you believe that he is genuine? And first of all, and what was your reaction to what was said yesterday?
Well, I'm afraid I see it all as window dressing. Until actions do speak louder than words, I won't believe it. I've heard it from successive leaders of the Catholic Church and other churches that they're willing to move their position, but nothing's happened. Yesterday, I witnessed the committee accept and confirm that they had accepted that the Holy See had violated the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Let's not forget there have been an endless series of cover-ups and sexual abuse scandals since 2001 and the emergence of this in Boston. The committee urged the Holy See to amend its canon law to ensure that it complies with the convention, which it signed in 1990. It urged them to make sure that there are no more secret Catholic courts. It urged the Holy See to ensure that all reports of suspected abuse are turned over to the police automatically. It urged them to uncover and publish their secret archives of investigations and punishment of offenders. It urged them to stop moving priests between countries to avoid justice and to improve the compensation for survivors of abuse. Now, I was astounded also by the arrogance of the representatives of the Holy See who came along and lied to the committee. They said that they cooperate fully with civil authorities, and they were corrected in that, as there's currently a Polish papal nuncio accused of child abuse in the Dominican Republic, who is being sheltered by the Vatican, who refused to allow him to be extradited. They also said that the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, that the Holy See was not responsible for them, yet they were staffed and run by nuns connected with the Vatican. They came along with a superior attitude. They made no concrete pledges. They were evasive and gave non-specific answers to questions. Now, I'm afraid this is a really excellent opportunity for the Church to try to put itself forward as a hero or doing something heroic. It would be so easy for the Church to comply with the UN Convention. They would be able to retrieve their reputation, which has been at rock bottom for a number of years now. But I'm afraid the representatives came along and were incredibly evasive.
Peter D. Williams from the group Catholic Voices. There's no shortage of information, there's no shortage of data collated on these cases. How can the Vatican justify its refusal for a UN request for this information to be passed over?
I'm not sure that the UN did actually ask for the information to be passed over, but let's just have a reality check here. The most important thing in this whole issue is the welfare of victims and the safeguarding policies that the Church puts into place. And actually for 10 years now, it's done a very good job in doing that. Since 2001, when we had Sacramentum Sanctitatis Tutela, which was a motu proprio given by Pope John Paul II and implemented by Cardinal Ratzinger, we saw the extension, for example, of the statute of limitations to 10 years after the 18th birthday of a victim, where before it was 5 years after the crime. That was then extended 10 years later under Pope Benedict XVI to 20 years, and indeed bishops now have the authority to waive that in all cases. We've seen cases where we've been able to speed up laicization procedures. They've encouraged bishops to report crimes to civil authorities. There are so many things the Church has done, and indeed in this country the Church has done a lot to make sure that its safeguarding policies are actually one of the best in the whole country. So it's important to have a balanced view on this, that the Church does care about this. And in fact, when we talk about the UN here, the Holy See is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So every 5 years, like every other country who is a signatory, it comes every 5 years to report on how it's going on in terms of its progress in implementing those rights. What happened here with the United Nations committee, and this is a committee, by the way, it's not a judicial body, it's not a legislative body in any kind of thing. They weren't interrogating them, they weren't subjecting them to some kind of investigation. This is simply the Holy See coming along and saying, right, okay, this is what we've done, this is what we are doing, and we welcome anyone to tell us this is how you could do it better. What other things can we be doing? That's exactly why Pope Francis set up his commission to advise him on safeguarding procedures, to make sure again that the Church is the best as it can possibly be, and making sure that throughout the world the Church is the best at safeguarding. But sometimes one further thing it is very important to just mention here. Right. The Church is not a sort of top-down Stalinist organisation where everything is controlled by the Vatican. It's actually a hugely decentralised organisation where responsibility for the everyday matters are really down to dioceses. Dioceses are in individual countries. So it's not the Vatican's responsibility to sort of tell that, every single diocese, right, this you must do this, you must do this, must do this. And all of the abuse that we have seen happen, all the cover-ups, have been on a diocesan level. So when we talk about the Church, we often have to make the distinction, I think, between the Vatican, the Holy See, which is the Pope, and all the sort of major matters, but then the ordinary diocese where actually safeguarding is a practical reality.
But Paul Keane, what do you think? Presumably victims won't really be happy unless priests are in jail.
Well, there are priests in jail who have been found guilty of abusing children. Unfortunately, the Church has been all too similar to other institutions going back into the 50s, when there wasn't a society where people could feel they could come forward, where the Church at times, the local church, wanted to protect its reputation. So it preferred to move people on or not talk about things. And of course, so many institutions suffered from this in the 60s, 70s and 80s, where we thought therapy was the way. We'll just simply make the priest better, rather than recognising the awful affliction that was given to the person who's been abused. But the Church since 2001 has really stepped up its game, and I would say the Catholic Church leads the way compared to most institutions in good practice. And if you want to know what the Vatican expects as minimal good practice, it's on the Vatican website. It's straight off the home page. I think the characterization we've heard of what went on in Geneva is most unfair. I mean, I know Bishop Scicluna, who was one of the representatives, very well from when I was a student in Rome. And when he began to deal with the cases of abuse, not whether those priests should be reported to the authorities, that was just presumed, but when the cases were sent to Rome to decide whether they should be stripped of their priesthood, if it was proven by the authorities that they were guilty of a crime. The Church isn't this hugely centralised body when it comes to many things. It is down for the local church. So we referred to the cases, the Magdalen laundries in Ireland in the 50s and 60s, an awful situation which was too representative of Irish culture generally then. But that was the local church, and it was the state employing the local church. It's awful what has happened, but I think the Church gives a model to the future of how things should be. Now, there is, and most cases we're talking about are the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. We're dealing with historical cases.
But when you say that the Church has stepped up its game since 2001, but a major report in 2009 into Irish allegations of paedophilia revealed Dublin archbishops turning a blind eye to cases of abuse between 1975 and 2004. That's 3 years after 2001. So there's this kind of disparate nature of the Church, accepting that it's not just all about the Vatican.
But when you look at the
shows an institutional shortcoming, doesn't it?
When you look at the number of cases, though, they're preponderantly the 70s and the 80s, and it's certainly true. Thank God there was that report into what was going on to Dublin, and what was recognised by that report is if the local church had followed church law, then things would be much more different. Unfortunately, the local church said, we'll send the priest to therapy, when in fact church law, canon law, said, this person should be dealt with as a criminal offence.
Can I get your response to that, David?
I'm sorry, the canon law doesn't require cases to be dealt with as criminal offences. The canon law was promulgated back in 1962 and is still in force, and requires all these allegations to be kept entirely secret by priests, by the person who is making the complaint themselves.
I'm sorry, I have to correct this. This is simply not true. Actually, the laws that are going about this go back to 1922. They were re-established in 1962 and then replaced entirely in 2001. And actually, they in no way suggest that you should have some kind of court which makes sure that people have to be secretive about this. The only mention of secrecy in 1962 under Criminal Sollicitationes, which is the document of which we're discussing, is actually about members of a tribunal who are discussing this case as to whether or not to defrock or laicise a priest. In other words, to actually implement procedures on a church level against the person who's engaged in this. They have to be secretive about, or they have to be confidential with regards to the actual tribunal itself. But the victim has no requirement of secrecy in terms of going to the police, in terms of going to civil authorities, in terms of getting help from anyone. There's absolutely no requirement of that at all, and there never has been. Whenever we talk about this quote-unquote pontifical secrecy that keeps on coming up, it always means confidentiality on the church level for the tribunal, the procedure that's dealing with these kind of cases. That is absolutely separate to any kind of civil investigation.
But the secrecy that people talk about is a code of omerta, a code of secrecy. I mean, do you see it that way?
That is clearly the case. And I think that many people within the church actually acknowledge that now. As a simple Christian, my understanding of Christ and the Bible was that Jesus said, the two things he said more than anything else were to love one another and to not have fear. The only people that Jesus condemned were people who hurt children or destroy the innocence of children. And I think that's the message that we need to bear in mind as Christians, and I think that's the message that the church needs to remember, or the officials of the church. But I also would challenge the notion that the Pope is not an absolute ruler who can make things happen if he so wishes. I mean, I was brought up as a Catholic. I was at Mass not very long ago. The Holy Father is still prayed for. The Holy Father is to be obeyed. If Francis was to turn round and to say to those dioceses around the world who have this information, allegedly, and I don't doubt it, pertaining to priests who are still at large, shall we say, and therefore a danger to children, I can't see why the Pope does not instruct the diocese to hand that information over to the authorities. I would have thought that was quite simple.
They already ought to, and in fact, I mean, you have to give me an example of a priest where this hasn't actually happened, because it is actually required for anyone, certainly in liberal democracies, they should be handing over this, and the Vatican has prescribed that in its latest documents in 2010 under the Normae Gravioribus Delictis. So when you actually look at what the Church has done, and this is really important, because on the one hand we have to have two balances here. We have to say, look, the most important thing here is the welfare of children. And we have to be honest about what the Church hasn't done, and we have to be honest about what the Church has done. And the Church has done so much, and which I think is actually often ignored by people who, for very, very, very understandable reasons, have a great deal of concern for the other side of this issue, which is the victims. We have to have a balance here, and we have to say, look, we all care about the victims, but what we have to have is an honest discussion about what has been done and what ought to be done next. And I can't think of a single thing the Church could do on the Vatican level more than what it has already done. And certainly in this country, I think we've done a fantastic job. That's not to say the Church is perfect.
On the obedience point, though, certainly a lot of these cases, okay, we can talk about secrecy, but there's a reluctance of victims to go forward, isn't there, Paul Keane, because the priest is seen as something other. That they are seen as different, and they are put up on a pedestal, and it is very difficult to be believed. And certainly footage a film that I saw about deaf children being abused by priests, nobody would believe them. Fundamentally, the priest is seen as something other, and that leads to a degree of secrecy.
Could I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes, go ahead.
I think that the priest in the community is seen as far more than that. The priest in the Catholic community, in the Roman Catholic community, is seen as the conduit to God. And that is, I think, where there is this additional level of, I would call it, evil, when abuse has been perpetrated by a person pertaining to be of God.
Let me get Paul's response to that. The clericalism of Catholicism is actually a barrier to openness. People won't want to come forward.
Well, I don't think there's a clericalism, certainly in Western Europe, but I think it's certainly true that if the priest is not viewed as a conduit because he is in this significant role as a representative of the church, and of course when a priest has abused, that is so damaging to the person who has been abused in their own personal relationship with God, that even adds to the awfulness of what's already occurred. But I think that, for example, in Western Europe, certainly priests have been held in high regard traditionally in society. And you cited the example of the awful case of abuse of deaf children, which happened in the 60s, where the police refused to act because the police wouldn't believe it, even though the case was reported to the police and involved by church authorities reporting it to the police. They chose not to act. And of course now we've discovered, various cases of celebrities in the United Kingdom being on trial. Why did those who were abused not step forward sooner? Because they said, I didn't think anyone would believe me. So that has been a problem. But that's not a problem today. I mean, we can talk about the systems we have now in the United Kingdom, which came after a report some years ago called the Lord Nolan Report. And we have stringent practices now. I've been a priest for 10 years. I've never been on my own in an enclosed space with anyone under 18 in those 10 years. And anyone who's working with young people or vulnerable people, so therefore including people with disabilities or those who are frail because of old age, all of those who work in our churches in England and Wales are checked to make sure they don't have a record with the police. Now, that will become more and more common throughout the world. There is a real difficulty for the church where you have, let's say, perhaps an impoverished legal system in Burundi or certain war-torn parts of the world. In Western Europe, we're able to really make sure things happen quickly. It will simply be harder for the church, as for all agencies in certain parts of the world. But this is the church's desire, and it will happen as soon as we can make it happen, that no one feels coward because of their respect by the priest.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Well, accepting those limitations of jurisprudence across the world. David, can I get your reaction?
I echo the concern regarding the third world. Now, the UN committee that I've just been sitting in the session is designed, the convention is designed to be a minimum standard for the protection of the rights of the child. 120 countries have signed up to it. and the research has been done by these academics and experts in child safeguarding who are on the committee worldwide. If they are asking these questions and the Holy See's representatives are refusing or obfuscating in responding to them, I fail to see how it can be said that the Holy See or the Vatican or the Pope can be acting responsibly. It just, I hope that some action will come through from this committee. I hope that when Pope Francis actually digests all this, he will raise his pen and do something about it. But I'm afraid, on past experience, when I've been in contact with bishops, etc., through legal cases, I see none of the willingness to actually put these things into practice.
Some observers, and I don't want to be too simplistic about it, but some observers have begun to ask whether the tradition of celibacy in the priesthood has contributed to child abuse. Now, I will quote somebody who's actually said this, the Hamburg Auxiliary Bishop Hans-Jochen Jaschke, I hope I got the pronunciation right. He said that the celibate lifestyle can attract people who may have an abnormal sexuality and cannot integrate sexuality into their lives. Controversial, maybe a bit simplistic. I'd like to get your view on that, Paul.
Well, the idea that simply because someone is celibate suddenly becomes a danger to children or is attracted to children is clearly ridiculous.
Okay, would it perhaps suggest that a certain degree of dysfunctionality may be pre-existing in somebody who would seek solace in an all-male environment?
Could it be true that, particularly in the past, that people have dealt with the internal conflicts they've had by seeking the safety and the non-questioning position of celibacy? That may well have happened. What's happened, of course, now in the contemporary church is that we're, as all institutions, we're much more aware of the complexity both of sexuality and also of our psychological makeup. And so, for example, in this country, we have what's called the St. Luke Institute. When anyone ever steps forward now to be considered for the priesthood, they're sent there for some days to have psychoanalysis, to have a look at their emotional maturity, their sexual maturity, emotionally. Our gained understanding, as with all parts of society, we've done a much better job at this. I think we're doing a very good job at this. In the past, where celibacy has been hiding in place for some, I think that is certainly true. But none of us realised that at the time. We do now know that. But celibacy in itself clearly doesn't make somebody more likely to be an abuser. In fact, if I may just point out, of course, sadly, most abuse happens within the family home.
The NSPCC's report on child abuse and neglect in the UK today, the most recent one, actually found that the vast majority of abuse of children and young people happens not by any particular kind of adult professional, but by peers, friends, boyfriends, etc., and to a lesser degree family members, siblings and parents, who by definition are not celibate. So the idea that celibate people are more likely to abuse, or that the celibacy is causing that problem in the Catholic priesthood, is simply contrary to the facts.
I'm not quite saying that, though. I'm not quite saying that, and I would like to get your view on this, Pete. What people are saying, and there's a priest, Tony Flannery, he's quite controversial, but he has also made this allegation that it kind of leads to a sort of, perhaps somebody who is maladjusted sexually would be attracted to the priesthood. It's not that is a direct link.
It's an interesting one, and I agree with Paul and Peter. There's absolutely no link between celibacy and child abuse, in the same way there's no link between homosexuality and child abuse.
Absolutely.
And I would also agree that the vast majority of abuse occurs within households. At NAPAC, every day we hear from many dozens of people who are telling us mostly that they were abused by their father or their stepfather. And I have to declare that the priesthood may have lost a priest in me 40 years ago, because it was something I considered seriously. But even as a youngster, I knew that I didn't have that gift, if that's the right word, of celibacy. And I would have been one of those priests, and I do know a few who may have gone into the priesthood and would have ended up having relationships that would have been breaking the rules, as it were. So I think celibacy is an entirely different conversation than around child abuse. But I guess the point that bishop or archbishop or whoever it was that you just quoted was mentioning was that most people, and I stress most people, can't get their head around how somebody can be celibate. I get it, but I know I couldn't be. but some people are, and I've known many good priests and religious over the years who are good and faithful people, and doubtless celibate. But I also know that there have been many people lost to the priesthood because of their desire for a relationship with somebody else. And I've never had a problem myself of, and I've watched The Sound of Music many times, of course. You can love somebody else and you can love God equally. So I think for what it's worth in the future, I think if the Catholic Church is to survive and thrive, I think it's probably going to have to look at allowing people like me to consider that route.
But let's say, all things being equal, the best outcome happens, that there is some kind of redress for victims. What about in the future? And in fact, there was an intriguing papal document where the Pope said, we are all sinners, but we are not all corrupt. And some analysts were interpreting this observation as maybe he's advocating some kind of screening if young men with pedophile tendencies are to be excluded. I mean, would you interpret it in that way? And perhaps going forward for future priests, there will have to be some kind of check and balance to ensure that they are right for them.
That's already happening.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly the picture around the world will differ. Often, in these things, in this sort of particular area, perhaps Western Europe and North America can lead the way. We already know, in fact, even in the bad days of the 60s and 70s, we know, for example, from the John Jay report, which was carried out in the United States, that Catholic priests were less likely to abuse than your average male in other institutions. So first, I think we need to get proportion at the issue. I say that without taking away from the awfulness of when abuse did occur, but that we always carry on making sure that people come in emotionally and mentally mature and don't have paedophile tendencies. I mean, of course, absolutely.
Peter Williams, what about the reputational damage to the Catholic Church? Do you see that being mended?
Well, of course, reputation isn't anywhere near as important as the justice for the victims and for the actual responsibility of the church to put in place real child protection policies and safeguarding procedures. That's the more important thing. But in terms of the reputation, I think reputation is complicated by two things. On the one hand, it's about making sure that the church lets society know what it has done, because clearly there's a lot of ignorance about what the church has done. There's this widespread idea that the church hasn't done anything, it covers up at the Vatican level. All of this is nonsense, but we need to be able to point out the facts about this issue. But also just to say the church's whole ethic about safeguarding children is absolutely intrinsic to its very nature, and where there have been failures, they have been on a diocesan level. They've been by a few individuals. They do not represent the Catholic priesthood itself by any means. And the church can improve its reputation by talking about what has been done, what it ought to be doing, what it plans to do, and in a much better way, I guess, but better PR. But that's nowhere near as important as the facts of this matter, which is what the church has done and what it continues to do to safeguard the rights of children.
And I'll give the final word to you, Pete. What would constitute closure for you, given your personal experience, for your group, and out of these hearings in Geneva?
Oh, that's a massive question. When people are abused in childhood, I mean, there is always hope, there is always healing, and that's what, as a charity, we strive to do. Closure is not a word that I use very, very often, because I don't think any of us who were abused will ever perhaps get our head around why it happened and really understand what caused it to happen. In terms of the Catholic Church, like many other institutions, I would like to see continued openness, banging the drum for NAPAC and survivors. And I'm very fortunate that we've been working quite closely with the National Catholic Safeguarding people here, for whom I have great respect, and we've had some limited support from them. But actually, we've got a very wealthy church. We've got a very poor charity. I would like to see the church actually help us financially so that we can in turn help the many victims come forward. Not just victims of clerical abuse, as I say, they are in a minority, but they are not an insignificant minority. But every day we hear from hundreds of people who are seeking support and help to move on. And to go back to the point that Paul made, as a Christian myself, I think that the worst consequence when a child is abused by somebody purporting to be of Christ is to separate them from my God.
That's Pete Saunders from the group National Association for People Abused in Childhood, that's NAPAC for short. Also Peter D. Williams from the group Catholic Voices, and also here in the studio Father Paul Keane, who is the chaplain for the University of Essex, also a member of Catholic Voices. On the line we had David Greenwood from Stop Church Child Abuse Campaign. Many thanks for joining me. Brendan Cole on The Voice of Russia.